Trapped CEO couldn't breathe. Then a little girl began to sing. Rain streaked down the tall glass windows of the corporate tower, each drop racing the next toward the streets below. The city's skyline blurred under the heavy grey clouds, as if the world itself had slowed down. Ethan Carter stepped out of his sleek black car, a driver holding an umbrella above him. The wind cut through his tailored suit, but his mind was already inside the meeting he was about to attend. His watch read 3:17 p.m. He hated being even a minute late. The marble lobby greeted him with polished floors and the low murmur of employees hustling between offices. A receptionist smiled nervously as he passed. Everyone in the building knew who he was. Ethan's shoes clicked sharply against the floor as he walked toward the glass elevator at the center of the tower. The elevator stood like a transparent capsule, giving a clear view of the storm outside. He pressed the button, his reflection staring back at him from the mirrored panels inside. The doors slid open with a gentle chime, and he stepped inside. With a practiced motion, he pressed the button for the 48th floor. The elevator began its smooth ascent, the city shrinking below. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the skyline for a brief, electric second. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. His focus was locked on the deal waiting upstairs. The hum of the elevator was steady, a familiar background sound. He glanced through the glass walls, watching the rain hit and streak down the exterior of the tower. As the elevator reached the midpoint, the lights above flickered once, then steadied. He frowned, glancing upward, a faint unease brushing against him. The hum of the machinery faltered, just for a breath, then continued. Another flicker, this time longer. Before he could react, the elevator lurched violent, sending a jolt through his body. His briefcase slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the floor. The motion stopped, completely. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The lights dimmed to a pale emergency glow, casting the glass capsule in a strange yellow hue. Outside, raindrops clung to the glass like frozen tears. The silence inside the elevator was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the cables above. He pressed the control panel's door open button. Nothing happened. He tried close. Still nothing. The floor indicator above the door was stuck between 24 and 25. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of his neck. His breathing became shallow, his chest tightening with each inhale. The air inside suddenly felt warmer, heavier. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm, but it came out ragged. His eyes darted to the emergency phone on the panel. He lifted it to his ear, but there was no dial tone. Just static. He set it down slowly, his hand trembling slightly. He leaned against the cool glass wall, trying to steady himself. His pulse thudded loudly in his ears, drowning out the faint patter of rain outside. Memories he thought were buried deep began to stir. A boy of 8, trapped in a wrecked car. His father slumped over the steering wheel, the twisted metal crushing the doors shut, smoke curling through the broken glass. The feeling of air growing thinner, harder to breathe. That same sensation was now curling inside his chest. He closed his eyes, but that only made the memory sharper. His heartbeat quickened, each thump like a hammer against his ribs. He pressed his palms to the sides of his head, trying to block the images out. The elevator felt smaller by the second, the walls inching inward in his mind. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to open his eyes. The rain outside was falling harder now, streaks of water racing, edge each other down the glass. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. His breathing was no longer steady. Short, uneven gasps escaped his lips. He loosened his tie, yanking at it as if it were strangling him. Sweat formed at his temples, sliding down his face despite the cool glass behind him. He wiped it away, but his hand shook more than he wanted to admit. He stepped toward the panel again, pressing the emergency alarm button. A shrill ringing echoed in the small space, then faded. No response. His mouth felt dry. The faint metallic taste of fear settled on his tongue. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the panel. Closing his eyes, He listened, not to the storm, but to the stillness inside. It was the kind of stillness that made every sound louder. The creak of the cables above, the faint hum of the emergency light, the quick, shallow rhythm of his own breath. He clenched his fists, trying to find control over the fear rising in his chest. This was not a boardroom. This was not a problem money could fix in seconds. This was something primal, the kind of fear that stripped away titles and power. The rain blurred the view outside, turning the city into a watercolor painting. Ethan's reflection in the glass looked pale, unfamiliar. His jaw tightened, but it did nothing to stop the tremor in his hands. The memory of twisted metal and his father's final moments hovered in the back of his mind. He took another breath, slow, deliberate, though it felt like pulling air through a straw. The storm outside roared, but it was the storm inside him that felt more dangerous. And there, in that suspended moment, Ethan Carter knew the walls were closing in again. The elevator's stale air pressed against Ethan's skin like an invisible weight, each breath a little harder to draw than the last. His shirt clung to his back, damp with the heat building in the confined space. A bead of sweat slid from his temple, tracing the edge of his jaw before dripping onto the floor. His breathing came faster now, short, sharp pulls that left his chest burning. He reached for the emergency button and slammed his thumb against it, the harsh click echoing inside the capsule. A burst of static hissed in reply, loud and useless, rattling in his ears. His other hand gripped the side railing so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. The pounding of his heart was so fierce it seemed to drown out every other sound. It was all he could hear, all he could feel. A fine tremor worked its way through his arms, his muscles tightening with the futile urge to do something, anything, to fix this. He glanced upward, staring at the seam where the elevator doors met, as if sheer will might force them apart. But they remained closed, immovable, mocking his desperation. A faint metallic creak above made his stomach twist. His throat felt dry, the air warm and heavy, and for a moment he thought he might not get enough oxygen at all. He tried to swallow, but it was like forcing down stones. His mind skittered in a dozen directions, chasing solutions and finding only dead ends. The quiet around him was suffocating, not the peaceful kind, but the tense, dangerous silence of being trapped. Then through the rapid rhythm of his breathing, he caught something faint. A sound so soft at first, he thought it might be his imagination. It was a tone, a note, barely audible beneath the hum of the emergency light. His brow furrowed. The sound was steady, smooth, and warm. A hum. Not the mechanical kind, but human. He turned his head slowly, unsure if he was ready to see what was making it. And there she was, in the far corner of the elevator. A small figure he hadn't noticed before, in the chaos of his fear. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, sat cross-legged on the smooth floor, her back against the glass. Her tiny hands clutched a worn-out teddy bear, the faded fabric rubbed thin from years of love. A strand of dark hair had fallen over her cheek, but she didn't push it away. Her gaze was steady, resting somewhere on the floor between them. Her eyes, wide and dark, didn't hold the panic he expected. Instead, there was a stillness in them, a calm so certain it felt almost out of place in the stifling heat of the elevator. The low hum continued, soft and even, like the whisper of a lullaby that hadn't yet formed into words. It wrapped around the air between them, cutting through the jagged edges of his fear. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply kept humming, her teddy bear tucked under her chin, as if the world outside that small bubble no longer existed. Ethan found himself staring, his chest still heaving, but his mind catching on that sound like a lifeline. It was strange, how something so quiet could feel so loud inside his thoughts. The thundering of his heartbeat began to compete with the melody, one raw and frantic, the other soft and unshaken. His grip on the railing loosened without him realizing. The metallic taste of fear was still in his mouth, but for the first time since the elevator stopped, it wasn't the only thing he noticed. The girl's humming shifted almost imperceptibly, the gentle tone stretching into the shape of words. It was so quiet at first that Ethan wasn't sure if she was truly singing or if his mind was simply filling in the sound. But then the melody began to take form, soft and trembling like the first threads of dawn creeping over the horizon. Her voice carried no force, no demand for attention, yet it commanded it entirely. It was delicate, almost fragile, yet within that fragility was a warmth that spread through the stale air. The words, though faint, flowed with an unhurried rhythm, each note seeming to linger just long enough to touch the silence before melting into the next. Ethan's eyes flickered from her small hands still holding the teddy bear to her lips, barely parting as she sang. The sound wove itself around the hum of the emergency light, replacing the oppressive stillness with something living, something human. There was no grand performance in her delivery. It was the kind of song not meant for an audience, but for the heart of one person in need. The corners of Ethan's vision softened, the hard edges of panic blurring into the background. The tension in his jaw eased. His shoulders, once tight and rigid, began to drop with each passing note. The sound was not loud enough to drown out the storm beyond the glass walls, yet it seemed to push it farther away. He felt his chest rise and fall more slowly now, no longer dragged by frantic gasps, but guided by the steady pace of her song. The melody carried something achingly familiar, though he could not place it. It was like catching the faint scent of something from childhood, a memory too deep to name, yet powerful enough to stir him. His eyes, still fixed on her, began to blur with the warmth gathering behind them. He did not want to blink, afraid that doing so might break the fragile moment she was creating. She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained low, as if her focus was not on who was listening, but on the song itself. There was no hesitation in her voice now. It had grown steadier, fuller, as though with each word she was weaving a net to hold him up. Ethan leaned back slightly against the glass wall, his hands slipping away from the railing he had clung to moments ago. His breaths now matched the rhythm of her melody, each inhale meeting the rise of her tune, each exhale following its gentle fall. It was not just a song. It was an anchor pulling him out of the current that had been dragging him under. He closed his eyes, not from fear this time, but from the strange, unexpected comfort of surrendering to sound. The darkness behind his eyelids was no longer the claustrophobic shadow of the trapped elevator, but a space where her voice could echo freely. In that space, the walls no longer pressed against him. They seemed to dissolve, leaving only the vibration of her song and the quiet thud of his heartbeat, now calm enough to hear clearly. Somewhere inside him, something long locked away shifted, a door opening just wide enough for light to spill through. It was in that light carried by her song that Ethan felt the first thread of peace in what felt like years. The melody wrapped around him like a blanket, and somewhere deep within that warmth, the edges of a memory began to stir. It came not in sudden flashes, but in slow, vivid layers, peeling back years he thought had hardened beyond reach. He was small again, no taller than the arm of the worn sofa in his childhood home. The room smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth drifting in from an open window. Outside, a storm pressed against the glass, wind rattling the frame in steady bursts. He remembered sitting curled in his mother's lap, her arms wrapping around him with a strength that made him believe nothing in the world could touch him. Her voice floated above the low growl of thunder, carrying the exact same tune now drifting through the cramped elevator. The sound of her singing was not perfect. It wavered in places, catching on breath, but it had been safe. And safe was all that mattered. He saw her lips moving in rhythm, her chin resting lightly on the top of his head, the steady sway of her body, keeping time with the lullaby. He had forgotten how small her hands had been, how they smelled faintly of flour from baking bread earlier that day. He had forgotten the way her heartbeat pressed against his back, a steady drum beneath the melody. That night, He hadn't feared the storm at all. He had only listened, and somewhere between the words and the quiet spaces between them, he had fallen asleep. It was, he realized, the last night before everything changed, before the accident, before the silence in the house became heavier than any storm. The image blurred, faded, and for a moment he was caught between then and now, a grown man sitting in a trapped elevator, yet feeling the echo of a boy safe in his mother's arms. The song began to slow, each note hanging a moment longer in the air before drifting into stillness. The final tone lingered as if reluctant to leave, then dissolved into the hum of the emergency light. His eyes opened slowly, the weight in his chest different now. Not the crushing panic from before, but the ache of something tender and long missed. He turned toward the girl, his voice low, almost hesitant, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile thread between them. "Where did you learn that?" The question carried more than curiosity. It carried the echo of a child who once knew that same song. The girl lifted her head, her eyes meeting his for the first time, and there was no fear in them, only simple truth. "My mom sings it when I'm scared," she said softly, her voice as unshaken as her gaze. "You looked scared." The silence between them held for only a moment before a new sound crept into the air. Faint at first, barely distinguishable from the hum of the elevator's emergency systems. It was the low murmur of voices, distant, but growing steadily louder. Ethan tilted his head, listening harder, the tone of the words too muffled to make out, but undeniably human. Then came a sharper noise, the metallic scrape of tools against metal, deliberate and purposeful. He glanced upward toward the seam of the ceiling where the maintenance hatch sat, catching a flicker of shadow as someone moved above. The faint rhythm of rain outside mixed with the clinking of metal, and for the first time since the elevator had stopped, there was a sense of forward motion, of something happening beyond the walls. A voice called down, muffled but clear enough to make out, "Hang tight, we've got you!" Ethan exhaled slowly, not realizing until then how tightly he had been holding the air in his lungs. The sound of tools working grew louder, the squeal of bolts loosening making the elevator shake slightly. He glanced at the girl. She was still seated with her teddy bear, her expression calm, as though rescue had always been certain. Light suddenly pierced the dim interior, spilling in from the narrow crack as the doors began to force apart, with a groan of metal straining against itself. The beam widened inch by inch until, with a final screech, the doors gave way, and the full glare of the lobby's overhead lights flooded in. The rush of fresh air hit first, cool and clean, sweeping away the warmth and heaviness that had clung to the elevator. Ethan blinked against the brightness, his eyes adjusting after so long in the muted glow. A hand reached in from outside, and instinctively he stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking once against the floor before he crossed the threshold. But just as his foot touched the safety of the hallway beyond, he paused and turned back. The girl was still in the corner, holding her bear, watching him with the same steady eyes she'd had since he first noticed her. Without hesitation, he stepped back inside, lowering himself to one knee so they were at the same level. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a weight beyond the simple words. Up close, he could see the faint flush in her cheeks, the way her fingers curled around the bear's worn paw. "You saved me." She tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth lifting in a shy smile that barely showed her teeth. "I just sang," she said softly, as if explaining something obvious. "You saved yourself." For a moment he couldn't look away, the truth in her words settling over him like a quiet certainty. Then, standing, he extended his hand toward her. She took it without hesitation, and together they stepped out into the brightness, leaving the shadowed space behind. The following days passed in a strange haze for Ethan, the rhythm of his life moving as usual. Meetings, phone calls, contracts, Yet underneath it all was the steady echo of a small voice singing in the dark. It was impossible to shake. It followed him into boardrooms, into the back seat of his car, even into the quiet of his penthouse at night. He found himself wondering who she was beyond that elevator, what her life looked like when she wasn't holding a threadbare teddy bear and singing to a stranger. On the third day, he decided wondering wasn't enough. With the help of his assistant and a few phone calls to building security, he learned her name, Lily. She lived in a small apartment on the east side of the city, the kind of neighborhood where streetlights flickered, and every sound echoed off narrow walls. Standing outside the building that afternoon, he was struck by how far it was from the towering glass offices he spent his life in. The paint on the bricks had long since faded, and the stairwell smelled faintly of dust and old wood. When the door opened, it was her. The same calm eyes, the same quiet presence, though now her hair was tied back, and she wore a t-shirt a size too big. Behind her, a woman appeared, her mother, with tired eyes but a polite smile. She welcomed him inside, confusion plain on her face, until he explained why he had come. He spoke not like a CEO delivering a pitch, but like a man who had been changed in some unshakable way. He told them what her song had done for him, how it had cut through fear in a way nothing else could have. Her mother listened, leaning against the kitchen counter, her arms folded, but her expression softening with each word. When he finished, Ethan reached into his briefcase, not for a contract or a check to flaunt wealth, but a simple envelope. Inside was the promise of a fully funded education for Lily, school, books, opportunities beyond anything her family could currently afford. He made it clear this wasn't a handout. "I'm not doing this because I pity you," he said gently. "I'm doing it because your daughter gave me something I didn't think I could have again." Her mother's eyes glistened, but she didn't speak at first, glancing down at Lily, who clutched her bear and looked up at him with the same calm certainty as before. In that quiet living room, filled with the faint smell of brewed tea and rain seeping in through the window, Ethan felt a weight lift from him. Not the jolt of a deal closed, but the quiet release of something heavy he had carried for too long. Over the weeks that followed, he found himself visiting from time to time, not to check on the progress of his investment, but simply to talk, to listen, to share small moments that had nothing to do with money or power. His world, once measured in quarterly reports and profit margins, began to make space for the sound of children laughing in a cramped kitchen, for evenings spent without a phone in his hand. People in his company began to notice changes too. The sharpness in his voice was softer, the rush in his step slower. He no longer filled every silence with work. Sometimes he let the quiet stay, the way he had in the elevator that day. And in the rare moments when life's pressures closed in on him, he would remember Lily's song, not perfectly, but enough to hum it under his breath. It wasn't the melody itself that calmed him, he realized, but the reminder of what it had meant, that even in the tightest, darkest spaces, there could be a voice steady enough to make the walls feel farther apart. From that day forward, the man who had been defined by ruthlessness and unrelenting ambition became someone who remembered to breathe and, when the moment called for it, to sing.